and we want to enter into an interfaith dialogue with you and find the commonality between our faiths. There's two problems with that. There is no commonality in our faith, first of all. But secondly, in the Islamic faith, you cannot take infidels as friends. It is all taqiyya. It's deception to draw you in, to not only protect the Islamic faith, but to further the Islamic faith. And 300, and most of them, I mean, they represented all denominations. A lot of Baptists, a lot of Assemblies of God, tons of Lutherans, Episcopalians, big and Episcopalians. But it was all denominations. These people are so duped. Chrislam.
Oh yeah, Chrislam.
Right. That's essentially what they were supporting was Chrislam. And of course, right after the Yale Declaration is when this whole Chrislam thing started. But when it comes to Islam, people are absolutely blind. It's almost as if they're afraid to face the truth on who these people are and what they're doing. And again, it's because they don't understand Islam. They don't understand that only 16% of Islam is a religion. But they treat the whole thing. They treat Sharia, they treat financial compliance, Sharia compliant finance, and they treat it all as if it's a religion. It's not a religion. It's a geopolitical system. It's a legal system. But they treat it all under the First Amendment as a religion, and that's. Well, first of all, misinformation and disinformation are both tools that have been used for a long time particularly by the communists. And you'll find that if you go back and look at the history of any Marxist movement, what you'll find is that part of the initial strategy is a well-orchestrated misinformation plan and disinformation plan. The misinformation plan is the message that you want to send to the public that you're dealing with, and the disinformation plan is really, in my view, how you're going to get that out without it being attributed to the actual source of those lies. So I think we see both in America today. Well, the Soviets have used misinformation and disinformation very effectively certainly since the days of Joseph Stalin. They've used it not only globally, but they've also used it specifically against America. Now, I think that what you'll find is that there is still a Russian orchestrated disinformation campaign going on in America, which has probably been here since the 30s and has never really been exposed for what it is. And those of us who came out of the military would call it a number of things, one of which is an influence campaign, to influence American attitudes, to influence public opinion. And if you go back and read the book, The Naked Communist, what you will find is essentially they lay out in that exactly how they intend to influence American attitudes and American public opinion. Let's just take an issue like motherhood. Now, what they're trying to do is destroy the family. Well, you put out enough misinformation through disinformation programs to convince women that motherhood is a burden. Now, what does that do? It destroys families because women no longer want to have children. They have been bombarded with information, and much of it comes through the Western media, that motherhood is a burden. You'll never reach your full potential if you are held back by having to take care of children. So you start to see a disintegration of the family. They will have a misinformation program that focuses on the whole issue of, for example, homosexuality as being a normal, healthy, acceptable lifestyle. And then once you're bombarded with that long enough, you begin to believe that. Well, what is it doing? It is an effort to disintegrate the families, the family structure, the most important structure in America, by the way. The reality is you don't have to go to church to be a believer, to be a worshiper. So the church structure is actually not the most fundamental structure in America. It's the family. You cannot repopulate your society and expect to have a healthy society if you don't have intact families. So I think we see in a number of ways how they've tried to influence. Another thing that most Americans are not aware of is the misinformation campaign that is carried in our school system, where we are losing a perspective and understanding of our history. We're losing, as a consequence of that, our identity, where you'll even find books that say that Muslims discovered America. Eric Steckelbeck with CBN did a great program on this several months ago, where he exposes the lies that are being told in our textbooks today about the history of this nation. There's no focus on the Constitution, for example. There's no focus on the price that's been paid for this nation. There's no focus on the intentions of the Founding Fathers. What were they trying to achieve, not only with the Constitution, but with the various amendments to that Constitution that gave us a Bill of Rights. And so a lot of it is just altering our history, but a lot of it is ignoring much of our history, and that's all misinformation through what I would call disinformation programs. Lieutenant General Pacheco was trained by the Russians. Was trained as part of the Soviet empire that existed during his time. He was trained by them, by the KGB specifically. Keep in mind that during the period of the Soviet empire, from right after World War II until really kind of 1990, 1991, when everything disintegrated, what the KGB did was they trained senior officers in all of the Soviet satellite states. They trained them in a variety of things, one of which was misinformation, because it was so powerful. And many of these people became very, very good at it. They not only followed the Soviet model, but they actually were very creative against their own populations in using misinformation to maintain control of their own populations. And you look at Romania at the time under a guy named Ceausescu, and it was brutal, it was harsh, and people didn't know what the truth was, which was one of the reasons that some of the broadcasts by a number of different media outlets into those Soviet satellite countries was very important, because it gave them truth where they were bombarded with misinformation constantly. Well, first of all, the Soviets are very astute politically and economically. The Soviets knew that the United States was dependent on Mideast oil and that dependence would grow. So the more turmoil they could create in the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf region, the more pressure they put on the United States, and in their assessment, the more willing the United States would be to start making compromises. So as the Russians sent agents into that part of the world to stir the passions of the Muslims there against the hated Jews, which theologically is their enemy. The Jews are the infidels along with Christians, but the Jews, because they reside right there in the Middle East, the Jews are the number one enemy by them. So I think what we saw was the Russians stirring their passions, trying very hard to put pressure on Israel to create conflict in that part of the world, which would draw the United States in, and thereby draw the United States' attention away from what the Russians were actually doing as they began to expand their influence throughout the rest of the world. If they could get us bogged down in the Middle East, if they could get us bogged down in something that we deemed important to protecting our very strong allies, that being the nation of Israel, then it would give them a greater opportunity to expand their influence and their power. And to some extent they were successful. And I think we're seeing sort of the long-term results of much of that now. Now, it ultimately failed for them because, we ultimately won the Cold War, so to speak, if you believe that there was a winner in that. That said, we are seeing the results now of their efforts to stir the passions of the average Muslim in that part of the world against the hated Jews in Israel. Vladimir Putin was very much a renowned operative within the KGB. He never accepted that the Cold War ended, and he never allowed the KGB to go away. KGB is very active today. What people don't understand is that we've criticized a member of Congress named Joe McCarthy for believing that the Russian influence in America, that the potential spread of communism in this country was an existential threat. We've made light of that and criticized him, but the reality is, in many ways, McCarthy was right. His methodologies are questionable, but he was right in terms of the existential threat. The KGB is still very much alive. The KGB is still doing all they can to influence the Communist Party USA, which is very prevalent in our nation, and to include people that have been brought into the administration that are avowed, acknowledged communist. And their influence today is still very, very great. If you go back and read The Naked Communist, and you look at what they said they were going to do in 1958, and how they were going to take over America, the techniques that they would use. In 1958, you would have laughed at them. In 1978, you would have laughed at them. In 1988, you would have probably said, well, they've probably moved further than we expected. But now look at them today and ask yourself the question, when you realize what they said they were going to do, ask yourself the question, have they accomplished it? And the answer is yes. KGB is very much involved in influencing American attitudes, influencing the actions of Americans, individual American citizens, and influencing our political system. They are very effective, and the KGB is right in the middle of it. There were actually Russians, when the Cold War ended, there were actually Russians that said to us, don't believe that we're going away. There were a number of Russians who made that statement to us, we're not going away. We're changing our strategy. Now, so how do you change your strategy? Well, you go underground. You change the name of your organization. You change the name of the KGB. Well, the KGB by any other name is still the KGB. It is still the most influential entity in Russia today, more powerful actually than the Politburo. And it is powerful because the man that is in charge of Russia is a former member of the KGB and considers himself to still be in charge of the KGB. So you can change their name to the FSB or to anything you want to, but the KGB is still the KGB with the same functions, same capabilities, and the same ultimate objective, and that is to destroy America. I don't think that's the case exactly. I think that there were people who saw the demise of the Soviet Union coming. And it came largely as a result of Afghanistan. But it was also just the absolute total collapse of the economic system in Russia. They could not sustain it. They could not even feed their people. And I think that they saw that coming, so they orchestrated, how can we leverage this? How can we best leverage this? Because on the one hand, we can't sustain what we have, But we can leverage the ultimate demise of the Soviet Union. We can leverage that in a way that ultimately we will prevail. Because right now we are the monolithic enemy of the West, of Western values, of Western culture, of the Western economy. We're the ultimate monolithic threat. But once we take that threat away, they will collapse on their own because they will become more like us. That's what they believed. They will become more like us because if you look at the pattern of societies, first of all, great societies only last about 200 years. So we're on borrowed time. And where do they always go? They always go one of two routes. Either they go to an absolute brutal dictator or they move through socialism to communism. Now, they then ultimately fail again. I mean, it's just the pattern of societies. But I think that they saw it coming, and I think they orchestrated a concept for how will we leverage that. They never lost their focus on America. They never lost their focus on destroying America. But I think that they saw that there was a new strategy to be used that would allow us to destroy ourselves. Wow, I think we're doing that, aren't we? But I mean, if you look at the hard line that they took at one point, and then you sort of move through phases. You know, Nikita Khrushchev slamming his shoe on the desk at the UN. We will bury you. Well, what happened then? He got to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he lost his credibility. So I think that was the beginning of the end for them in some ways, in that they knew they had to change their tactics, because you can only push America so far, and our society was still more homogenous than it is today. Even though, you know, we were a melting pot in terms of American attitudes and American values, we were more homogenous. We were a closer people at that time. So you change your attitudes where you no longer perceive the Soviet Union or the Russians to really be a threat. And then what happens is you start to deteriorate from within. That's why Islam is such a problem. You have the President of the United States stand up and say it's a religion of peace. Well, what is peace, first of all, in Islam? What is peace? Peace is Sharia. Peace is and what is freedom? Freedom of something? No, it's freedom from something. It's freedom from man-made laws. What is justice? Justice under Sharia, codified in Sharia law. So we can't come to grips with that concept as Americans. It's alien to us. Here's the problem. Americans want to be amused. Now think about it. Muse is to think. Amuse is without thinking. So they'd rather sit in front of the TV and watch a reality show and then take a 30-second soundbite, which could be from the media, it could be a news flash, or it could be a political ad. That political ad, for example, might say, well, the Republicans are for the wealthy and the Democrats are for the common man. And they form their opinion on that 30-second soundbite, and then go back to being amused. Because they make no effort to try and discern the truth. They make no effort to go beyond what is in their comfort zone. So they will believe the lies of the media, and the media does. The media is part of the disinformation campaign that we started out talking about. The media is one of the purveyors of that. So they form their opinions without any independent research, without seeking alternate sources, without looking at it from a broader perspective, and then most importantly, without thinking. Americans need to start thinking. I don't know everything. In fact, everybody around me would tell you just that. I don't know everything. But I go out and try to find out as much as I can about as many things as I can that impact our society and the future of my grandchildren. But most Americans are quite comfortable just being amused rather than having to think for themselves. We've got to get beyond that. Well, if you look at the most fundamental principle that our founding fathers believed in was inalienable rights. Now, the early settlers that came to America came largely because they rejected the authority of the king of England in most cases. They rejected his authority in spiritual matters. That's where the whole concept of separation of church and state actually came from. It wasn't from Thomas Jefferson. They rejected the king's authority in spiritual matters. And it was after the First Great Awakening that the Black Robe Regiment, or the pastors in the colonies, began to seek out these powerful men and press them on the issue of inalienable rights. Our rights come from God, not from the crown of England, not from King George. Our rights are inalienable. And that brought about the revolution. Well, today, if you look at what's happening in this country, we're moving away from that concept because it's not taught in the school systems. There's no focus on inalienable rights because it runs counter to the dialogue of the people that want to destroy this nation. And we're getting back to a concept that the Founding Fathers rejected, which is that our rights come from the government. That's why big government is growing. You know, the government is growing because we are losing sight of the fact that our rights constitutionally are inalienable. And we now see ourselves as being wards of the state, so to speak, where our rights, our privileges, and our sustenance are derived. And I think that we have to get back in our school systems to going back and refocusing on the fact that our rights are inalienable. Now that means that you've got to maintain, an atmosphere where people have First Amendment rights, where they can worship freely, and we're losing that. I think we went through a phase where we were able to declare victory, but in reality, the Cold War never ended. Yes, the Soviet Union disintegrated as we knew it. That said, what you're seeing now is we've gone through that phase of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, a declaration of victory by America, but you're seeing it being reconstituted. I think you'll soon see the Central Asian states that will be not necessarily what they were before in terms of being Soviet puppets and so forth in some kind of alliance, but very clearly the Soviet influence in Central Asia is being reestablished, so the Soviet southern flank, so to speak, will be protected by Central Asia and by the influence of the Russians there. That's all coming together. I think you'll see the Ukraine, for example, coming into a much stronger alliance with the Russians, and I think you'll start to see some of the other states in that region that will be realigning themselves with Russia, not as the Soviet Union, but I think you'll see alliances there that will essentially accomplish the same thing that the Soviet Union did. So do I think the Cold War ever ended? No, I think it transitioned, and it's transitioning again, and we're seeing essentially the same thing coming back together. First of all, Putin and the Russians are capitalist. They probably don't like to admit that, but they're capitalists, just like the Chinese. There's a lot of money for Putin and his government in helping North Korea as well as Iran to develop nuclear programs. For example, the Russians make over $1 billion to build a reactor in Iran. There's over $1 billion profit for them to build a reactor. Secondly, the Russians for over 100 years have wanted influence in the Middle East, Persian Gulf region. aside from the fact that there are warm water ports there, Russia's future is largely tied to gas and oil. Now, if they could ultimately create a situation where they dominate the oil markets, because not only do they produce gas and oil, but they also influence the Persian Gulf region. Well, to some extent, the big dog in the Persian Gulf region right now, because they are developing a nuclear weapon, is Iran. So if they could establish that kind of influence, and the Iranians would essentially dominate the Persian Gulf region, the Russians corner the market on gas and oil. And which is another reason that their relationship with Hugo Chavez down in Venezuela is so important. So I think that there's an economic aspect of this as well as a geopolitical aspect. My view is that Romney was only partially right. To say that Russia is the biggest enemy, I don't think we know that yet. For reasons that I've already stated, I think Russia is a huge threat to America and to American stability and American security. But I also think that we have to look realistically at the potential of a nuclear-armed Iran as being a huge threat, not only to America, but to global stability. And the reason is because their intention is to use that nuclear weapon against Israel. Now, that's because of their theology. If they create enough bloodshed and chaos, their Messiah will return. That would draw the world into conflict. So I have a great regard for Governor Romney, and I'd really kind of like to understand better what he was actually trying to say, because Russia is a huge threat. And an emerging Russia is a serious threat, and a Russia under the leadership of Vladimir Putin is something that we have to pay very close attention to. But I think that it's Russia and those people that they are associated with that is really the key. Who does Russia influence? Who is Russia allied with? Iran, North Korea, and on certain issues, even China. Well, I've seen intel reports over the years that the Russians were working with the Palestinian terrorist organizations, not just Hamas, but the PLO and others. And I have a couple of friends that came out of those networks. I think that would clearly tell you that they received arms and ammunition and all. Now, on the one hand, the Russians have an abysmal history of anti-Semitism, which goes back a very long ways, to include in the Orthodox Church. So I think that's changing now, but they have a history of anti-Semitism within the church, but certainly the Russian government was very anti-Semitic. But again, I think that their ultimate objective was to create turmoil in that part of the world that would ultimately draw the attention of the United States away from where Russia was trying to expand its influence even after the Cold War, so to speak, to draw our attention away from things. That's why, partnering with Hugo Chavez, for example, is important, because we have to focus our attention on, in South America rather than in areas like Central Asia where Russia is expanding its influence. So I think the Russians have been very involved with some of these terrorist organizations in terms of not only training, but materiel. Keep in mind that the guy that developed the whole concept of black liberation theology was an avowed hardcore Marxist, James Cohen. Now keep in mind also that Che Guevara, who influenced much of Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, he influenced them in the direction of Marxism. He was a hardcore Marxist who, in fact, was influenced very heavily by the KGB and by the whole Russian misinformation campaign and the Russian efforts to get entrenched in that part of the world. So many of these leaders that have led these movements have been puppets of, Russia. They've been supported by Russia. They've been trained by Russia. They've been influenced by the theology of the Russians. And that's why I think we need to recognize that the Marxist movements that have occurred in Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean, Cuba specifically, were all part of Russia's plan to dominate our hemisphere and ultimately encroach on the security of the United States. The events in Benghazi. When you have the United Nations ambassador 5 days after an event going on the news service and spreading information that is clearly false, there could be no question that everybody knew that what she was saying, to include most of the American public, was false. That is a misinformation campaign, and she is using a disinformation methodology to spread that by saying that it came from the CIA. Well, no, the CIA has now testified that that didn't come from them. But what was the purpose of all that? What was the purpose of misleading the American public? The purpose was to ensure that the administration was reelected and that their chances of being reelected were not hurt because they had spread another disinformation, I'll say lie, and that is the lie that Al-Qaeda is on the ropes, that the administration has defeated Al-Qaeda, that they're all but non-existent, only to find that not only are they still very powerful, but in a nation where we supplied arms and flew a no-fly zone to overthrow the leader, Muammar Gaddafi, Al-Qaeda has now set up training bases and camps and logistics depots. So not only has it not gone away, not only is it not on the ropes, but it is very powerful and we're still their target. So you go out and you tell the American public that it was a result of some obscure video in California rather than telling them the truth that Al-Qaeda attacked us, killed 4 of our Americans. Al-Qaeda is very much alive and we're still their target. That runs counter to the objectives of the administration, is to convince us that they've succeeded in winning the war on terror. They have not. I'm very hopeful that we will, and I know there are some members of Congress that are still very passionate about this. And I will tell you that my issue is a slightly different issue. I'm bothered by the fact that our UN ambassador, spread misinformation to the American public, and I think did so very deliberately. I'm bothered by the fact that we sent our diplomats into a very dangerous, volatile environment without proper security, to include a Marine security guard. I'm bothered by a number of things, but let me tell you what bothers me the most. There was a breach of an American ethos and an American value associated with this whole operation. In 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman wrote a letter to Ulysses S. Grant, March 10th, 1864. He said, "I knew wherever I was that you thought of me, and that if I got in a tight spot, you would come, if alive." That's an American value. I'll never leave you on the battlefield. The United States Army has what they call the Ranger Creed, which says, in the 5th stanza of the Ranger Creed, it says, "I'll never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy." There was no effort to put the U.S. military on the ground in there. Oh, they moved some forces around. But there was no U.S. military that was sent in there to, A, try to save those people, and if you can't save them, bring their bodies home. You know, Jimmy Carter said to us when we went into Iran in 1980, and this is not a highly regarded president, not in my mind, but when he gave us the authorization to go into Tehran and rescue 52 Americans at that embassy, the only thing Jimmy Carter said to us was, if one of them gets killed, bring their bodies home. Don't leave them. I commanded the Delta Force during an 18-hour firefight in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1993. It's known as Black Hawk Down. We were fighting over 2 dead bodies that we could not get out of the crash in that helicopter. We were fighting over 2 dead bodies. We took more casualties because not one single man was willing to leave those 2 comrades behind. In Benghazi, we left 4 Americans there to fall into the hands of the enemy. And to say that, well, we couldn't have gotten there in time is not acceptable. To say we didn't know enough about the situation is not acceptable. You go, you take the risk. There's an American value associated with that. I'll never leave a fallen comrade. And we violated that. What does that say about our society? What does that say about our leadership? What does that portend in the future for this country? That we'll put people in harm's way and then not do everything we can to include taking all the risks necessary to go and get those people. That's what bothers me. Well, the Democratic Party is part of the leftist movement, and the leftist movement is represented by a number of special interest groups. Take your choice: the Marxist, the gay and lesbian lobby, the unions, the Planned Parenthood. The Democratic Congress, or the members of the Congress that are in the Democratic Party, are really part of that whole movement. So what do? They change the dialogue. It's misinformation. They change the dialogue. So they call abortion choice. They call same-sex marriage equality. It's all the same principle, the misinformation. Till you hear this long enough, and all of a sudden, and they very carefully select these terms and these words. Choice. We believe in choice as Americans. We believe in choice, the right to choose. But that has limits. So they change the dialogue. They continue to perpetuate these words, these phrases, these sound bites until it becomes the common, lexicon of the American people. And then those who still believe in traditional values were fighting an uphill battle to change the dialogue back. And that's all part of the Democratic Party jumps on those things very quickly, and they perpetuate the dialogue of the special interest groups. We're seeing it happen. Well, where do you start? The unemployment figures, okay? I mean, did we ever get the straight information about the unemployment figures, which were dropping? Well, they're dropping because of what? Because people are not looking for jobs anymore, because people are in government jobs that are, in many cases, are just temporary jobs because of TARP money. So we never got accurate information on that. It was I think the whole thing was a deception. The economy, the debt, the effects of taxing the rich. You could tax the rich at 100% of their income, and you're only going to operate for probably 30 days. But that's misinformation. It's not the truth. It's not accuracy. It is designed specifically to influence how you think. Now, to be honest, both parties do that. That's why I think so many Americans are becoming very disgusted with both parties, because both parties will use those kind of techniques to keep from having to tell us the truth. But I think the Obama administration was very untruthful in terms of the realities of the unemployment figures, of the economy, and a variety of other things. You know, I'm not an expert on this, but I do look into it, and we know, we even discovered, and thank God that the media was willing to report it, that some of these renowned experts had been cooking the books, so to speak, to support their cause for a long time. We also know from just weather patterns that there are cycles of, the earth heating and the earth cooling. There are cycles. We also know that El Nino has an impact periodically on weather patterns, to include heating and cooling. So I think the issue is the environment. Do we have an obligation to protect our environment? Absolutely, absolutely. But for these environmentalists, these people that subscribed religiously to this global warming, I don't think there's evidence that they are correct. In fact, I think there's probably more evidence that they are not correct. We need to protect the environment. But I think this whole thing has been manufactured because there are zealots that they've replaced God with a theology of global warming. And it's impacting our society in a significant way. The environmental movement is very dangerous. Now, since we're here, I'm going to tell you a couple of things. Because of the environmental movement, we have large sectors of our border with Mexico that are national forest. And the environmental influence on those national forests is such that in large sectors of our border, the Border Patrol can only go into these sectors on foot or horseback. But people coming across our border can drive four-wheel drive vehicles across our border and into these national forests, and there's no way to pursue them on foot or horseback. So we've got illegal immigrants coming across our borders bringing all kinds of things, and drugs is the least of the problems, because we're finding a lot of other stuff like prayer rugs and terrorist training manuals and so forth. But the Border Patrol really has no effective way to pursue them because of the environmental regulations. That's one of the impacts of the environmental movement and the rigid policies of the administration through the EPA. The other thing is that's why we can't drill at home, because of the environmental movement. What if we said tomorrow it is more important for us to become energy independent and stop the largest transfer of wealth in the history of mankind to the Middle East? What if we said it is more important for us to do that than to abide by these, I think, ridiculous regulations by the EPA? But in doing so, we're going to do all we can to protect the environment, and we will establish prudent rules. We could be energy independent in a decade. We wouldn't need all that oil over there. It would change our foreign policy substantially if we didn't have to have that oil. But it's the environmentalists, it's the global warming theology. First of all, if you've ever been to Israel, you will know that the Muslims that live as citizens in Israel have the greatest freedom of Muslims in any Islamic country in the world. They have all the liberties that every Israeli citizen has. They're free. And if you talk to them privately, they'll tell you they do not want a two-state solution which would force them to become citizens of any state where Sharia would become the law of the land. But that kind of information is never promulgated. It's never exposed to the public as to just, how much freedom these people have. Secondly, all you ever see in our media, because it's part of this whole campaign of influencing people's attitudes and public opinion, all you ever see is the poor Palestinian. What you don't see very much of is the Israeli family that loses their son or daughter or mother or father from one of those rockets that's fired, and in fact, rockets that are fired when theoretically they're right in the middle of peace talks, which are always with Fatah. They're never with Hamas. But in an effort to destroy those peace talks, Hamas will fire rockets. Israelis are killed, lives are disrupted, property is destroyed, but you don't hear that. You don't see that. It's not part of it. The other thing is this poor plight of the Palestinians. First thing you need to remember is that Jews were Palestinians at one time. So who are the Palestinians? Secondly, when you are building the world's tallest building and you're building an indoor ski slope and you're building an air-conditioned golf course, you have to ask the question, why couldn't you take some of that money and put it into the living conditions of the poor Palestinians? You see, there are a lot of poor people in Israel as well, Jews, that need humanitarian relief too. But the only focus we ever see in the media is on the poor Palestinians. They have a legitimate need. But the media and the dialogue from the people that are promulgating this disinformation there is all about the plight of the Palestinians. No place to go. Well, how about looking at the history of that and realizing that it was King Hussein in Jordan that ran in and grabbed the land that the United Nations gave them. It was King Hussein that slaughtered 30,000 of them, that created Black September, the terrorist organization. There is absolutely no focus on that. You don't see that in the media. The rest of the Arab world hadn't treated them very well. And all you see is how the Israelis have treated the poor Palestinians, just rock-throwing Palestinians. Well, how about watching next time and go and video the home of the Israeli that just got mortared or rocketed, or the bus that a suicide bomber just got on, and all those innocent Israelis, and some of them are Muslim, by the way, that are laying out in the streets there. A lot of these heroes that have been created are, in fact, thugs. Hugo Chavez, for example, is one of them. Mao is another one. Another one is Evo Morales. These are thugs. These are thugs, but because they've got the propaganda machine, the misinformation machine of the Russians behind them, because they've agreed to support Russia. They've agreed to spread communism in their hemisphere. They're made out to be great heroes when the fact of the matter is all they are is corrupt thugs. Now, Mao Zedong, I think the last thing I saw, Mao Zedong killed about 60 million of his own people. That's a hero? Che Guevara. He was a brutal man that killed thousands of people. He's a hero. People want to wear his T-shirt. He was, by the way, He was a racist. He hated black people. He had no regard for black people. But they're wearing his T-shirt now and as a symbol, and wearing, Mao caps and all. Mao was a mass murderer. He brought nothing but destruction on China, on the Chinese people. And over time, we build them up to have been great revolutionaries that stood up against the establishment. This is developing again with this guy in Africa named Cohen. Cohen's a murderer. He's a rapist. He's a child abuser. But now he's getting lots of attention, and they're going to, there's an effort to make him a hero. And you'll see kids wearing his T-shirts, They don't have any clue who these people were or what they did. Mao was no great revolutionary. Mao was a thug that killed 60 million people at least. And it's incredible how that, over time, the reality gets lost and the misinformation makes heroes out of these thugs. The left is trying to justify its positions on things. Vietnam is a good example, with Oliver Stone being one of them, where they try to make every soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine that served in Vietnam a wild-eyed, drug-crazed killer that just wanted to go in and abuse people and blow things up and destroy the nation. Couldn't be further from the truth. The great courage and heroism and compassion that was demonstrated by so many of our people there. But Vietnam is one of those things. But I think you also see that Hollywood today has a tremendous influence on our understanding of history. And so many of the people involved in Hollywood, so many of the actors are on personal campaigns to influence the way Americans think. It's not just the money they contribute to liberal causes and all that. It's what they say. It's how they get in behind people that are bent on destroying this country, at least destroying the America that we know, and replacing it with an America that they see in the future, which is very Marxist, communist oriented. Now remember that there's always a ruling elite. In any Marxist movement, there's a ruling elite. That's why I think you'll understand that why would a man like George Soros get involved? Why would he help fund some of these media projects, some of these movies, that type of thing? Why would he do that other than the fact that it supports his cause and the cause of those of like mind to move America towards communism? That's really what they want. And then ultimately global governance and one world government, because there's a ruling elite. There is a wealthy, you're talking about a 99% and a 1%, ultimately there is a 1%, and they're very, very wealthy and very powerful. But I think Hollywood has, not just Hollywood, but media in general is very much part of promulgating the message from the communists. They may not recognize that they're communists. I mean, the people who are doing this may not even recognize that they're being influenced by communist theology, communist doctrine. They may call it socialism. Well, socialism is a pathway to communism. It is used to ultimately achieve the objectives of the communists. And I think that so many in the entertainment industries have become so much part of this movement that they certainly love to make movies. This Hurt Locker movie, that was about as anti-military as you can get. And what it did is it perpetuated this notion that, our young men and women that are serving over there are just wackos. All they're there to do is seek a adrenaline high and kill people. but they're very popular movies. Senator John Kerry, if he wanted to do America a favor, he would apologize for what he said about his fellow comrades in arms back in the Vietnam era. He testified to things that he never witnessed. And he's never apologized. He's never been remorseful. In an effort to further his own political ambitions, Senator Kerry went and threw his medals over the White House fence in protest. Well, that was all a ploy to increase his status and draw attention to him. But the reality is, the things that he testified as to having seen, he never saw those things. He was perpetuating the myth of the left about our young men and women that served in Vietnam. And I think it's high time for Senator Kerry to come clean and apologize for what he did. You know, I cannot begin to tell you how important I think it is for us to set the record straight through documentaries like this, through movies, and through teachings in our school systems that come from an accurate history of America. People like movies, people like documentaries, people like programs that are informative. That's why I think the History Channel, for example, has been so popular, because there is an eagerness to know history. I think these kinds of things are very informative, but also very helpful in terms of bringing people up to where they need to be in understanding the history of America, in understanding the situation that America is in today. And when you link the two, you say, how did we get here? How did we get from a history like this to a current situation like this? And it makes people start to think, and then to do their own research to try and figure out how we got from inalienable rights to being a nanny state. I think these kinds of things are critical. Well, first of all, we have to fill the void between the history of America and the current status of America's current situation. We have to fill that void, and we fill it through movies and documentaries and other sources of information that help people to understand where we came from and where we are, and change the course of America. So that's important. Second thing is, though, during the American Revolution, John Adams said, the pulpits have thundered with the ring of freedom. We have to get back to where the church is the dominant influence in America. Now, that's a dangerous statement on the one hand, because today the church has become, has gotten off, I think, off center in terms of the theology. But if we could get the church to get back to the basic gospel of Jesus Christ, biblical values, and to start to speak with a voice of influence in America today, to where we're not influenced as much by the media, by television, by Hollywood, as we are by the church, I think we would see a substantial change in the nation, because the church was the dominant influence at one time, and today it's not. The church is basically a non-entity in terms of influencing the environment in America. So I think if we can get pastors to stand up and be bold, I think we need to develop alternative media outlets. I think we need to find media outlets that become just as powerful and prolific as the mainstream media is today, but presenting a well thought out media presentations about our history, about what's going on in America today, and more importantly, with spokespeople that are willing to say, This is what we need to do. Here's how we deal with this. Here's where we should go. You as an individual citizen, here's what you can do. I get this all the time. Here's what you can do. Here's how you can influence what's happening in your community. We will take America back, but it will not be from Washington. We'll take America back from the bottom up. It'll start in the local church. It'll start in the local city council. It'll start at the local school board. And as that groundswell grows, and as we start to see revival in America, where we start to see people really coming before the Lord in an attitude of repentance and seeking that God would forgive us first before He blesses us. He forgives America. And then seeking God's blessings as a secondary thing, and we'll see the movements within our political arena as well as the revival within the church. We'll see those coming together. And I think that from the bottom up, we'll start to see change in America if we've got a sufficient media outlets, new media outlets, alternative sources of information that will start to inform people, that will start to help people understand where they should be and where they should be going and what they should be doing. I think we'll start to see things change in America. But as long as we sit there wanting to be amused, we'll continue to stay in our comfort zones. And I think the circumstances in America are going to force us out of our comfort zone. And then we're going to start looking for truth. And we'll find it in alternate media, we'll find it in the church, and we'll find it among our fellow Americans. Go back and look at the history of the United States and Israel and recognize that there was a time when the European newspaper called us the New Jerusalem because we took in so many Jews. Clearly, America was divinely inspired. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the founding of the nation was divine inspiration. We took in many Jews into this continent. It was Harry Truman who, with his own pen, after being told by everybody around him, do not recognize the state of Israel as a sovereign nation, took his own pen and marked through a portion of the document that was handed him that said the United States recognizes the new Jewish state as a sovereign nation. He wrote out new Jewish state and wrote in state of Israel. Harry Truman, a man that never should have been president, a man that was told by everybody around him, to include George Catlett Marshall, do not do this. He signed it. First nation to recognize Israel. And then it was an American colonel that had fought in World War II that trained and ultimately led the Israelis in their 1948 war. Right, he's the only man buried at West Point that died fighting for another nation. What am I saying? I'm saying that I would make the case that God has used America to fulfill His prophecy of calling the Jews home from the north and the south and the east and the west. That's biblical prophecy. And on the 14th of May, 1948, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when David Ben-Gurion stood up in the King David Hotel and proclaimed sovereignty, that was the beginning of the fulfillment of prophecy. And it was 1 hour later that the American president recognized Israel as a sovereign state. God has used America to fulfill His prophecy, and His hand has been on us. We turn our backs on the Jews. If we turn our backs on the Jews, I hate to even think of the price that America will pay, because I think that God's hand has been upon us largely because He's used us to recreate and to bless His chosen people. And we must stand with Israel. Now, if you look at it just from a political, practical perspective, they've been our closest allies in that part of the world since 1948. Give me a reason other than oil. Give me a reason why we should turn our back on them now. Do we stand for justice? Do we stand for a representative government? Do we believe in these ideals? Do we believe in American values? They believe in American values as well. Show me a reason why we should turn our backs on our closest allies since 1948 in the Middle East. I see no reason. I believe Genesis 12:3 is just as important today as it was when it was written.